All right, welcome to the EW Podcast. I'm your host, Eric White, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Benjamin Boyce. Benjamin is the host of the podcast, The Boyce of Reason, and notably, he was also a student at Evergreen State College during the now infamous May 2017 student protests, and is also the creator of the Complete Evergreen Story, a YouTube documentary series that examines those events. Thanks for joining me, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me, Eric. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
Are you on West Coast? Are we on the same schedule?
Yes. I'm in San Diego.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a cool place.
Yeah, I love it here. Yeah, it's beautiful, man. It's we actually just moved out of downtown and up to Carlsbad, which is a little more low key and laid back, which has been nice. Yeah.
Oh, right. You're prepping for middle age, aren't you?
Yeah. Just turned 31, already thinking about a country club membership and
Well, you got the collar for it, I'll tell you that.
Thanks, man. Thanks. I had to spruce it up for the new meeting with you today.
Oh, sorry. I'm wearing a very cozy hoodie. I hope it doesn't come across as me looking down on you.
Not at all. You're in the Pacific Northwest, right?
Yeah, Olympia. We're sitting at probably about 75 degrees right now. Probably like 68, but it'll probably get up to mid 70s today. Bright and clear, but usually we are in Thurston County, which, before the weather started becoming what it is right now, was the most wet county in America aside from Mississippi. But this one county in Mississippi is only wetter because of the monsoons or the typhoons or whatever it is. So they have all those flash floods, but we are just
consistently
rain. And then we get some months off.
Are you a big outdoors guy? I've seen some posts of you strolling around nature. It seems like you get out, make a point to get out. Is that a big part of your life?
I have a backyard and 2 cats that go on walks with me. I'm a total layabout.
That's all right. So what keeps you in the Pacific Northwest then?
I don't know. I just landed here in 2000. I landed in Portland, and I was in Portland from 2000 to 2010. Then I moved up to Olympia, and we don't live inside of Olympia. We live outside of it, and it's just I can't imagine living in a city anymore. And I like the mood of the place, though it can get a little depressing. I still like that. The kind of raininess kind of gets me into a certain headspace, and I kind of just enjoy it for some reason.
Is that good for your writing? You know, I don't know if readers or listeners of the show might not be super familiar with you. You're also a fiction writer, right?
I'm a closeted fictionist. Yeah. I'm eking out my my private stash of fictions that I've accumulated over the last 20 years. But for the most part, yeah, there's something about the rain that concentrates me. Kind of gets me in this kind of weird kind of mood, and steep in my own, I bask in my ownness.
Yeah, I've always found that like the rain, for me, it's a reason to stay indoors, to just focus on what you're doing inside. So it removes the thing in your mind that's like, oh, I should be out doing this, or I should be, with my friends at the beach. It's like, no, it's raining. I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the reason I wanted to talk to you today, as I mentioned offline, and I'll just reiterate for listeners and viewers, is I was editing your appearance on Greg Ellis's show, The Respondent. And, up to that point, I had been aware of you. I knew who you were and some of your backstory. But until then, I didn't really dive into your work yet. And once I watched that episode, I was like, oh man, this guy, I relate to so much about you. There was a certain witty intellect that I admired. And also you shared some details in that podcast that I personally related to. You talked about going through a depressive period, which I certainly relate to. And was actually a big reason I started this podcast in the first place, was originally as a mental health thing. And then I quickly realized that I wasn't that interested in like therapies and things like that. I'm interested in stories of that. And since then I've grown it to be more encompassing of my full range of beliefs, but that's maybe a story for later. But yeah, I just found myself really vibing with you. And then I took the time between then and now to dive more into your work and realize, man, this guy's a great interviewer. He's super creative. The documentary you put together about Evergreen was really well done. And so I was eager to have you on and just chat a little bit about some of those points and get to know you a little bit better.
Well, great. I still have to finish that freaking documentary. I'm stuck on chapter 24. Just like I have to finish it, but I can't.
What are you stuck on? I'm about halfway through. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, the last episode, it encompasses a lot and it shows just the fallout of everything that happened. So in 2017, there were the protests and the students planned a week of protests, and then there was a bunch of backlash and all the events that are covered in that documentary. Well, it's a multi-linear documentary because I jump back in time a lot and forward in time just a little bit, but the scaffold of the entire documentary is just going through that protest week and then what happened after that week. And then I go back and forth into the trainings and the seminars and the workshops that the professors and the administration went through and put the students through to kind of show where all this behavior and at least what the students are espousing when they're acting the way they're acting is all tied together into this social justice, equity, intersectionality kind of blob that people kind of talk about as wokeness right now. But so everything happened, and then what happened afterwards was that Brett Weinstein sued and left, Naima Lowe sued and left, Stacey Brown, which is the chief of police, sued and left. The college president didn't leave, stayed there for 5 more years and just recently retired. And over the course of those 4 years since the protests, that George Bridges, the former president of the Evergreen State College, has taken the college from 4,000 students down to 1,000 students. Doubled down on this equity stuff, and basically just enacted very terrible policies, or at least very inept policies that have just ruined the college's reputation and their income too. So now they're just hobbling along on COVID bucks. And that's like one of his parting gifts to the college is that, yeah, don't worry about money. We have all this money from the federal government because of COVID, and we're going to spend that for the time being until we get more students back. And I'll still be around. I'll be teaching, so you don't have to miss me at all. So they can't even get rid of him. So I just have to kind of cover that, and I have all the footage, but it's just I'm so tired of dealing with him and. It's difficult for me to deal with somebody that I don't like so much because I don't like being in a position of disliking a human being because it denigrates my own humanity when I denigrate another's humanity. But this person has decided to distance themselves so far from the truth and any form of integrity that it's really hard for me to respect them whatsoever. So I have it all. I just have to assemble it and just get it out there. But there's something that's causing me to like not believe in it, and I don't want to put it out there if I don't believe in it. So I just need to buckle down and just concentrate on it, be done with it, and then put out the whole 9-hour documentary as one file on the internet and have a streaming party or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. How do you view the rise of your platform in those events? And I don't want this question to sound like I'm questioning your talent at all. Like I said before, I believe you're an extremely talented person who seems to, I truly believe you deserve the platform you have, but your platform is a result of these events that say something kind of negative about American society. So I wonder how do you think about your existence as a public figure as a result of this kind of chaos?
Well, this is the thing. And I think about this frequently. When it first happened, so the Evergreen State College stuff happened, and there was so much attention on that. It was just the talk of the town. And while I was there and while it was happening, I was watching all these videos being made on YouTube specifically. The mainstream press kind of ignored it because it surfaced some very uncomfortable things about the dominant ideology, the successor ideology, as Wes Yang puts it, or wokeness, basically, which is ascribed and since then has been doubled down on within major institutions, except for Fox News and Wall Street Journal and the right-ish or right-leaning publications. They would talk about it, but the left didn't touch it at all. New York Times, Washington Post, etc. But YouTube took it up because that was just, YouTube has this whole marketplace for cringe.
No,
And
really? No.
Evergreen was peak cringe. It was like the distilled concoction of cringe. And so there's so many videos about this, and all these different commentators were making all this different commentary on this. And I was watching this. I'm like, well, that's really interesting that there's a platform for people to just talk about events like this, but they're missing so much of the story. I was there. Furthermore, I was working in the media department. I was on camera for a lot of these official Evergreen events, these lectures and these seminars and these trainings. And I know where all that stuff is. I know how to get it all. I know all the key search terms, and I just know how to get it. So I started to put that out there. And I went from this college student who went to this obscure liberal arts college in the woods specifically to get a degree, well, to hone my skills and to get some sort of credibility as an author of fictions, somebody who could comprehend what narrative is, how it operates, how to break it apart, and how to put it together. And I put all those skills under the term of narrative arts as something you practice rather than just a literature studies degree or something like that, which is something that you know about, like you know how to do something, applied imagination. And by the end of my college career, I had written, I'd done everything that I wanted to do, and I had this massive mound of material. I figured out what I wanted to do with literature, and I felt, well, I'm done. I'm done with literature. And I was just kind of coasting. I'm like, well, what do I do now? I guess I'm going to go and get a master's or doctorate, because I didn't know that the entire the entire structure of education was following in Evergreen's footsteps. Evergreen was part canary in the coal mine and part flagship, like leading the way for all these institutions and Washington State itself. So I had all this training in how to tell stories. And furthermore, my stories that I tell are incredibly complex stories. It's, I guess you might use the term metamodernism, though that term is really squishy, but it's postmodern fiction. It's about using all the different genres and all the different perspectives and all the knowledge that we kind of understand and take for granted, that there are different perspectives on any given story, and trying to unify all those things under a single theme, trying to take all that disparity of literature, all that disparity of interpretation, and unify it into one theme. Kind of like if you imagine a symphony, and then you have the winds, which would be the mythology, and the brass, which would be, I guess, your genre fictions like fantasy and horror, and then your drums, which would be modern literature. You take all those different genres, all those different types of storytelling, and you get them to tell one story altogether, which is brain-breaking work. I was crazy. My last year at Evergreen was all independent study. I'm walking around my woods at night talking to myself, going through and writing this whole thing. And I'm publishing the whole thing right now. Finally, I took a few years and I just set it aside. And now I'm going back through it. But by the end of that, I was done. I'm like, well, what do I do now? And then all this stuff happened at Evergreen, and then I started talking about it, and I'm like, okay, well, I have attention now. I've been in a desert, starving for attention. I've starved myself for attention. I've written 20 books by then, didn't publish a single thing, published nothing, 3 million words, published not a single one of them. But now I have attention. Now I have an audience. I don't have that mediating, gatekeeping infrastructure that literature had and still has, in an even more totalitarian sense nowadays. I could just go directly to print. And so I just went full grubby and just started publishing. Every other day I published another episode about this Evergreen thing. And I spent 6 months devoted specifically to Evergreen, going through all these emails, going through all this footage, talking about all the developments, going back and forth. And I had a well, comparatively to the rest of YouTube, I had a very small following, very small dedicated following base. And over the course of the last 4 years, and I started my channel I started this project and what we know as the Benjamin A. Boyce channel on June 11th, 2017, and now it's July 18th, 2021. I've slowly went from evergreen into different areas and just explore different things and try to, experiment with different forms of media making, like the talking head thing I did. I still do a little bit of that, but I haven't done any of that lately. I've been taking a complete break from that. But I did a lot of that commentary talking head stuff where you take an article and then you break it down, which is good for viewership. It's good for, doing that witty kind of thing, but it's unsatisfying to me to a certain extent, or I have to inhabit a certain persona that if I get too much into, he starts being everywhere and I just get really anxious all the time because I'm interacting with very critical negative stuff, which is your question. But then there are other ways of approaching toxic material or other ways of approaching problematic phenomena within the cultural discourse or the culture at large that are more or less critical. And one non-critical but not really creative way of doing it, though there is criticism and creativity in all of this work, but the interview was a way where I could be a meta storyteller by becoming the stage. I become the stage. I set the stage, and then I have the other person perform the story, which is their story. And I give my attention to them in such a way that I hope more or less evokes a very nuanced, deep, detailed view of what they're talking about, whether that's a personal story or their expertise or their adventure as a thinker or whatever that is. That sort of self-effacing mode of content creation it's not as quick to gain popularity. It's not as quick to gain views. Actually, it takes a longer time to get an audience going that route. It takes a long time unless you're lucky and you can import your audience from a quicker form of engagement to this longer form of engagement. But it's deeper, it's richer, and over the last 3 months, I've been doing interviews exclusively. Every once in a while, I do an Evergreen Story or something like that. And then that's also freed up since I'm not engaging critically with stuff so much, I can actually go back to my creative endeavor and kind of really just get into the mind space of creating literature, which is a completely different mind space than creating criticism, cultural critique.
Yeah. So it sounds like you view your position in the Evergreen Story and the resulting attention it brought you as being lucky, as almost being lucky to serve these other things that you're interested in doing.
I always loathed activists and activism. And then I went to a college that turned me into an activist and I ran with it. So, yeah. I'm just the anti-activist. And most of my stuff, actually, most of my themes come down to exploring some sort of area that activists have cornered the market of attention on and breaking their hold on that, such as with sex and gender and transition is one thing, and just breaking the activist hold on that. I've done a little bit of work with race relations in America. That stuff's heavier. It's really heavy work, but I've done some of that to break the activist hegemony on that discourse and to free it up for human beings to interact rather than ideologues interact.
Yeah. Why is the sex and gender and transitioning topic of interest to you? Is it simply just because you see an injustice being done where there's a lot of loud voices speaking for a marginalized group and not real? Let me rephrase this. To me, that the trans activism and the gender thing, it seems to be kind of hijacked by a certain amount of woke liberals, you would say, it's like the race thing where you have a bunch of woke liberals who are speaking for a marginalized group, and it kind of it drowns out the voice of the marginalized group, actually, to me.
Well, there's with race, there's the woke liberals, which we would think of as the white people, the rich, well-meaning white people who are actually in practice very bigoted They're much more bigoted than actual, what we consider the bad guys, the alt-right, because they're benevolent in their bigotry.
Yeah.
And so there's no stopping that. So there's that, but there's also a lot of race grifters. Unfortunately, the civil rights movement has been captured by a bunch of people who make big, serious bank off of that stuff. And they're not just activists, they're DEI trainers and stuff like that. But within the sex and gender thing, this is really interesting because I started to get involved in that because there was an incident at Wilfrid Laurier University in the end of 2017 with a young woman named Lindsay Shepard who got taken aside by several men in power and was grilled for showing a 2-minute clip about Jordan Peterson. Well, of Jordan Peterson and another person arguing over the correct way to use pronouns. And it was just an argument. She was teaching communications, so she thought pronouns has to do with communications. But then she was grilled, and Peterson was called a Nazi, and she recorded the entire thing. It's astoundingly out of just beyond the pale that these college professors would be treating a young co-ed like that, but also ideologically like forcing this issue, forcing one way of interpreting data or one ideology on this entire subject and making that the MO of the university. The university is no longer about education. It's about indoctrination. It was very, very clear in that incident. And that had to do with gender. And I went through and I dedicated a month and a half or 2 months to that story, like I had done with Evergreen, and just read through the emails and just like go through that and very slowly and mockingly produce content on that. And I was contacted by a number of trans individuals or transsexuals who, contacted me privately. They're like, I just want to live my life. I have a persistent issue called gender dysphoria, and this was the way for me to deal with my body and deal with society and live my life. And I don't want to control anybody's speech. I don't want to have anything to do with this illiberal craziness, because the activists on behalf of the trans rights people were being narcissistic sociopaths, just total narcissistic sociopaths. And therefore representing trans people as narcissistic sociopaths. So I'm like, okay, how do we break this down? Go back to Evergreen. What was the problem with Evergreen? People were unable to listen to each other and to speak to one another because there was an ideology that imprinted a certain rule set on how all discourse was to happen. And it was a horrible rule set, which created nothing but frustration and explosion. Nothing but catharsis. It was all catharsis and no resolution with Evergreen because of this woke ideology or whatever this stuff is. And so the way to counter that is to actually listen to people, to deplatform the deplatformers, and not deplatform, but unplatform them, unplatform the illiberal by not speaking to them, having conversation with people in good faith who are interesting, talk about their lives, talk about that issue, and do it in such a way that's much more fun, engaging, and enriching than all of this demagoguery. But once I started doing that with trans people, that led me to the detransitioners, which is this huge story. It's a huge story, and I was on it early, and it's going to be the defining story of this decade. It's incredibly, I think, this is just an opinion. Shouldn't say that it's not or speak like it's not, but the amount of medical malpractice that is going on with regards to specifically underage girls and boys who have growing pains with their identity, being caught up in gender ideology, and then that gender ideology being directly tied to medicalization, which is permanent, irreversible, right, and destroys their sexual function, destroys their body in a certain way, like literally cuts off the breasts of 13, 12, 14-year-old girls, and then and cuts off the balls of young men. That stuff is incredibly, profoundly disturbing, and it's completely being hidden, and even not even hidden, but actively persecuted by these trans activists who are very well funded, who are dictating laws, who are dictating the way that the medical system operates. And it's just crazy. So once you start going down that route, you trans people, detrans people, then you're like, well, what is gender? What is sex? Like, okay, Well, there's feminists. They have a lot of ideas. And before I started doing this, I was kind of this anti-feminist because being anti-woke kind of puts you in this anti-feminist thing. And also the pedigree of YouTube prior to anti-woke, there was kind of just anti-feminist and anti-SJW stuff, which is tied up in Gamergate. There's this whole pedigree of how history is unfolded on YouTube. And then eventually you get back into the atheists or the anti-theists and the theist argument. It all kind of just goes through these different upgrades. But I saw feminism as employing a lot of the same illiberal tendencies of very rigid thinking and very us versus them, oppressor oppressed tactics. This entire oppressor oppressed victimology was very active in a lot of the feminism that I saw. But these feminists were arguing against the gender ideologists. There's these gender critical feminists and then the gender ideologists. And you start to investigate feminism and you find out, well, there's all these different kinds of feminism. And then, wait, but what's feminism? It's about women. So there's all these different kinds of women. So I'm like, okay, well, I like talking to women. So, so you just kind of go down and you go down and then you just get into these conversations and you start getting plugged into these communities and then you just kind of route it out and you kind of your audience kind of shifts because they came on board for one thing and then you move into another area, but you absorb this other audience, but then those other audiences have these other parameters and they'll eat you alive if you say the wrong thing because the feminists are still feminists, you know. But anyways, so that's just that all that. And then you ask, well, what's the difference between males and females? How is society function to privileged males and underprivileged females? What is it to be female? What is it? What is the power of the feminine? What is the power of the masculine? And that all ultimately goes back into my creative endeavor, which is to create stories. And in order to create a big, long-lasting story that goes through time, you need generations, which means you need to have generation. And the only way for generation to happen in our reality is male and females getting together and negotiating attraction and then the consequences of that attraction. That's the bedrock of every story. From ancient times. It's always, if you go into the earliest stories we have, there's sex in the beginning. In the beginning, there was some sort of sex between a male energy and a female energy. And that's just going through all of our consciousness. And ultimately, I don't think that we can get away from gender, but we can understand it better. And so there's all this exploration to do because everybody interacts with it differently and everybody's got an idea because it motivates so much of their social behavior.
Yeah. Would you say then that, you know, when I first asked that question, I thought that your interest in the topic might just be the conflict that exists within it, but it sounds like there's a genuine interest about the fundamental questions that these different sides are arguing about. So I guess a way to rephrase that is if there wasn't conflict around gender and pronouns, but it was still, you know, if it hadn't reached a fever pitch where it's something that we're really focused on right now, would your interest still exist? Or are you more drawn to it because the voices are so loud?
Well, you, as a creator, as a content creator, one is dependent on their audience. And there are different levels of negotiating the dependence that one has on their audience. Your job as a content creator is to get attention, to keep attention, and then the masters start to manipulate or shape attention, right? And there's different levels to all three of those. There's a cheap way to get attention, and then there's a not so cheap way. But you basically have to stand next to a car crash because that's where all the eyes are. You have to go where the eyes are, and then you have to put yourself somehow between what's being looked at and the onlookers. So that's usually some sort of major conflict. That's where most people congregate. People's attention congregate around conflict. And there was this tweet that was going around where somebody was like critiquing this newspaper or this web blog, this major news source in the UK called The Guardian. And The Guardian has this thing about trying to make the world better, or trying to make people more happy or something, right? They have some positive thing that they want to do in the world. But if you look at their front page, it's conflict, death, fire, destruction, right? And somebody's pointing out the hypocrisy of that. But my thing is like, well, that's how you get attention. You have to go into conflict to get attention. So once you go into conflict, you get the attention, then people start hearing your voice. So then you have to keep their attention somehow. You have to keep their attention for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or an hour. How do you do that? The way that you keep their attention over the course of different times requires you to do different things with that attention. And then ultimately there's the outcome. What do you want to do with the attention that you get? Do you want to, you have to turn a portion of it into more attention so you can keep on doing this, but you also want to provide something. Well, you don't have to do this, but I think that it feels best for me when I provide something of value. And the only way that I really know that is when I get feedback from my audience, where I get a certain sort of audience feedback where people are appreciating it, or I am introducing people to voices that are changing their perspective on things or enriching their perspective on things, actually doing the hard work of injecting nuance into conversation, which takes a lot of time to do. So to try to wrap this up, I went everywhere, but yeah, so the conflict's there. With gender, there's always going to be a conflict, though. I mean, if you think of gender as not just a spectrum, but a polarity, it's the tension between the male and the female that causes that arc, and that arc is creates, I think, so much. I want to say all of culture comes from that. I'm not sure, but I think all of culture comes from that. But certainly, every human life is based on that tension and that desire. Desire has a lot of darkness in it. There's a lot of conflict there. So there's conflict all the way down with this. And then that conflict is resolved in very miniature ways in the way that I can speak to somebody of the opposite sex. And how do you negotiate being close and getting them into a place where they can reveal themselves? And I don't mean that vulgarly. That sounds kind of vulgar if you think of it one way, but
like
to really
physically reveal themselves.
Well, I have had a couple people show up naked, but that's another story. That wasn't my doing, that was theirs. But, you have to, this sounds real. This is like no red pill territory in the old sense of like the player territory. It's not that, but it's based on the same principles. You have to compose yourself in a specific way in order to speak with women. Same thing with men. There's a basic humanity that everybody shares, but there's certain sorts of tactics that you have to understand. And if you get in a good relationship or a flirtationship with a woman, there's always that conflict of interpretations, even on a very microscopic plane. And if you are aware of that and you just tease it just a little bit, that's generative. That causes some sort of conversation. This like, we're coming from two different positions. Let's understand each other. So there's always that conflict all the way down. You exploit it to get the attention, but then you refine it over time to really do the really fun stuff.
Yeah, I really like how you put that. And it makes me just look back on starting my own thing, my own show here, and how little I actually thought through what I was doing. I kind of just went for it. And it's only been in the last, I would say year and a half that I've started to really conceptualize what it is I'm trying to do here. And this is actually another reason I wanted to talk to you, was you had mentioned in the interview with Greg that you view yourself as value add, as I think you said something like added value, like you're bringing your guest on and just having them, like you just said, be the player on the stage. You're the stage and they're the interest. And that's kind of how I've been starting to conceptualize this is, there's so many great thinkers in our society and so many people never find their way to them for whatever reason. And so I kind of see this as a potential intermediary between people who maybe never would have discovered someone like you and yourself. Because I'm not, I've come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to be coming up with some brilliant insights on race that is going to blow everyone's mind, or gender, and so I don't know. I see that still is a valuable role, right?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing. Sorry, I'm gonna get a little genderish. That's kind of like a masculine ambition that dodges us, especially young men. They're looking for that brilliant thing. We're looking for the discovery. That's our value. If we can find that one thing out there in the world and bring it back to our clan, then we've kind of paid for our breath. Whereas, and I don't mean this sexistly, but I can see how somebody would read it sexistly, but women come packaged with production built into them. They can always provide human life. Not always, but like that's assumed that they can produce more human beings. Men, it's like, well, we can't do that. So we have to actually go out and aspire and inspire to that. And so that you can watch young men, 19, 20, like really, really on fire to find that one thing. And over time, since like it's been so long since I've been in that space, but I still have to kind of nurture that ambition to say something really meaningful, to do something really meaningful, to find that one phrase, right? But it's more of a game now. I'm looking for those brilliant insights as a game because it's accidental. You never know. So you just play and you play and you play and you play and play. If I play for the sake of playing rather than the sake of like making something awesome or changing the world or something like that, that's a good thing. But ultimately, I'm just here to play. That keeps me humble and not stressed out when I fail constantly, right?
What do you mean? To think of yourself as, can you explain that a little more? Just what you mean by that?
Well, so like the pressure to do something or to say something or to be the best or to, coin that phrase or to articulate the problems of the world in such a way that it changes discourse. It's a noble ambition. And it should be there. If you want to do that, you want to do that. I think that's good because that motivates you to put yourself in a position where that might happen. Right. But if you expect nothing less than that from yourself, you will go through life feeling terribler and terribler and terribler unless you're gifted in some way, because that kind of thing only happens accidentally. You can put yourself in a position to do that, but to maintain that position of getting close to that, I think it's best to not really assume that that's ever going to happen. Kind of just suspend the expectation for a particular result, but really engage in the play and really pursue that playfully. Does that?
Yeah. So it's as though you're recognizing that ambition is there, but not putting pressure on yourself to realize it immediately, but putting yourself in positions where the chance that it arises might happen, right? So yeah. It's being forgiving with yourself, but also giving yourself the chance to get there.
Yeah.
So is that how you view your interviews then, is a chance to, because a lot of the people you bring on are obviously, they're experts in their field, they're deep thinkers. How do you prep for that? How do you get into the mindset of interacting with some of your guests? Like, how are you?
Trade secret time now.
Yeah, divulge it. This is what I initially hit you up on about, and then you were like, "Well, are we recording? Because something about the red dot crystallizes my thinking." And I was like, "Well, I just wanted to get you on the phone, but sure, I'm down."
Oh man, how do I prep for guests? A lot of times I don't. Okay. I follow my, Eros, right? Cupid, Eros, kind of usually, well, always, at least in the Greco-Roman conception, as a masculine force. And you find him as the son of Venus and Mars, the goddess of love and beauty, and the god of war and destruction. And then Eros comes to be from them. But if you go back, way deep in the mythos, Eros was there even before anything happened. Before the masculine and the feminine met, Eros came and sparked that. So Eros is always there, that conflict, that generative kind of conflict that we were talking about. I think that there is a feminine version of that. That's the opposite and the equal, that lays the groundwork for Eros to operate. That lays the groundwork for the question to be asked, that provides the field for things to emerge, things of different quality to emerge. And that electrifies the field where that emergence can happen. And Eros being desire, his consort, well, his sister, I think of it as the very primordial, is curiosity. And that curiosity, if you can really understand what that is and really cultivate that in yourself as a creator, as a content creator of any stripe, if you have that curiosity, that openness, that exploratory principle, that hunger for something. So it's really related to Eros, but it's not Eros to inject myself or to exert my will and my force. It's to see what is there outside of me so that I can co-create it in its unveiling and its veiling. That curiosity has been something, it's like my patron saint for a very long time. And I learned that in preschool when I worked in preschool. When I beached in Portland, I ended up working in preschool, and I ended up telling stories to, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds and listening to their listening and watching their eyes get really open and absorbent and getting really close to that absorbent principle. That is what kind of guides me in my content creation. So I go through and I surf Twitter and I get connected with all these different things, and I just reach out to people and I just reach out to people and I reach out to people. And over time, I get enough expertise to understand what to do to start the conversation. But my curiosity will, as long as I'm listening to the audience and to the guest, my curiosity does everything that's needed to get out of the way and to facilitate communication, clarification. What do you mean by that? Or just finding the little, you can just hear, or I can feel these little, like fissures in the conversation that can open up onto like these rich oil fields or these aquifers of conversation. And if you kind of like with the dowsing rod, you're like, oh, there's some tension there. You ask about that, and then you just kind of go into that. So with very intelligent guests, very well-read academics, and people who are rather popular, those are really difficult conversations because you really have to get up to speed with them. And that's where the preparation really comes into being. But people who are more laid back or who are put in a position, whether by speaking with you or knowing you, to just approach it kind of in a more relaxed sense, then all that stuff kind of happens on its own. And you don't have to worry so much about knowing what's going on, because you're also facilitating people who don't know anything potentially about this. So coming in blind is actually a boon in a certain respect. So you kind of have to make this dance of knowing and not knowing to get it right.
That speaks to me. I tend to do preparation as much as I can, and I've found a mixed bag as a result, where sometimes the notes that I take will limit me in my conversation, where I feel like I have to hit all of these points. I've come up with 10 points and I'm like, fuck, we're an hour in and I'm only at point 2. Like I have to hurry this along. Where other times, if I just jot down notable things, like with you, I kind of just wrote down a few things I have up here on my screen that I think are notable about you. And I'm doing my best to listen and referring to these when I need to. But it's how did you cultivate that curiosity in you? Is that directly a result of your work with preschoolers, or is that something that's been with you your whole life?
I remember, that's a good question. I remember I moved, so I was in Portland. It was 2003 or 2004, and I got a new job at a cafe, and this cafe was run by a guy, and he did his own roasting. And he had his own shop where he roasted the beans. And so we all got hired because they were opening a new store, and we all did this group training. And I noticed myself just asking him more and more clarifying questions. And he started getting kind of annoyed with me because I was just causing him to like really
holding it up,
really like get into the details of what he's doing. I'm like, okay, well, I have to kind of control that. You have to meet it out, and then when I was at Evergreen, and I was around academics and other things, I just would ask questions like, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Or the students would make these presentations, and they're like, they make this big statement, and you're like, okay, well, I know this is cruel, but you used the word patriarchy and you just didn't define it. So let's go there. What do you mean by that? And what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And the teacher, I thought that the teachers would be doing much better job as teachers to be asking more questions than providing answers, really, especially when we go through the material and the material, you engage with the material, yes. But when we're interpreting the material, the educator educes or seduces the articulation out of the individual by asking questions, asking clarifications. I think I've never got a doctorate, but they do at the end, they do some sort of defense. And I can imagine that they're just being grilled and people are asking them very deep questions and like probing just how far they know that. And then probing how they perform that knowledge. So it's not just enough to have all the facts. You have to articulate that. And the question is the groundwork for articulation. So I don't know, like it's just something that I understood or I know or I do. And then when I started getting feedback that I was a good interviewer, I just kind of did more and more interviewing as I got feedback like, "Oh, you're a good interviewer." I'm like, "Okay, well, let's do that then."
Do you think that being in the situation, the protests, right there, front row seat for what happened in 2017, where you clearly understood what was going on was insanity? Did that? Did I wonder how that influenced your curiosity and your ability? Because being on the outside like that, obviously you're going to realize that, whoa, I'm thinking about this way differently than most people. Maybe I need to ask questions to not only try to understand where they're coming from, but also to potentially expose their blind spots where it's like, I don't know if you ever heard of street epistemology with Anthony Magnabosco.
Could you remind me of what that is?
Yeah, so it's a technique of conversation or inquiry, I guess you would say, that was first created by Peter Boghossian, and it's been extrapolated out and practiced very deeply by this gentleman named Anthony Magnabosco. And he goes on the street. Well, he used to. I don't think he's doing much of it anymore, but he would go out on the street, find random interlocutors, ask them about a core belief that they held. So maybe it's like, I believe in ghosts, or I believe that crystals have healing power. And instead of having a debate with them, he would just ask questions to do, kind of a Socratic dialogue where he's like, well, what does this mean? Define this. And, at the end of it, sometimes there would be people who are like, yeah, that is kind of a weird thing I believe. Like, why do I believe that? I'm not really sure. So I guess just to wrap up my question is, did that Evergreen story kind of instill a sense of you of the thing that might beat this is more questions?
I just have to spit this out, but I think it's much more stable territory to be asking questions than to be giving answers. I just think that it's much more it's territory that I'm much more comfortable in. I feel much more stronger when I'm the one who is in control of all the doubt than the one who's in control of all the certainty, right? But with the Evergreen story, again, like gender, so you're like, okay, what is this transition thing? It just leads you to all these different things. What is this woke thing? Everything's contained in this. There's 3 pillars of wokeness, one of which is obscured so that the other 2 can take precedence. There's sex, there's race, and there's class. Class is, let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about that because that's the real issue, even though I don't necessarily believe in class politics as a Marxist does. I think it's okay that there's low class and high class and mid-brow stuff. I think it's just, as an artist, I just understand there's popcorn and there's some sort of fancy quinoa baked crap, and there's like somewhere in between. But when you start to ask, well, here is what happened at the Evergreen State College. Here is what happened. Here's what this person said about it. Here's what that person said about it. It just brings up all these questions. Why did this happen? And why is it so infectious? Why does it does it really possess people? And you go through and you look at other colleges specifically at first, and you're like, well, they're doing the same thing. They're acting the same way. Like, why would you act that way? What is going on here? Why do you believe these things? And then then there's all these people who have an answer or who think about it in all these different ways. And then you go and you talk to them and you think about what they have to say about this. But then you go into, there's a huge, it gets really deep. It gets into, you start asking questions, you start tugging the thread of what wokeness is and how it's manifesting. You go back to the Protestant Reformation. Eventually, you get back to, we're dealing with things that are centuries old. This is the outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, modernism, postmodernism, this entire realm of thought. It goes really deep and some big thinkers. And then it goes into questions about spirituality. It goes into questions about what is the role of religion in society. And you can kick man out of religion, but you can't kick religion out of man. You can't do it. You know, all those atheists, we're going to live in a post-Christian world. Like, okay, well, here we are. Yeah. And all those atheists went right back to Christianity and started moralizing each other around social justice, right? They did this, they just recreated the entire thing without any sort of glory or art or beauty or transcendent story, no narrative, because all that stuff is fake and false, you know? So there's no container for all that moralization. There's no container for the irrational anymore. So the irrational completely overwhelms the rational. You're like, well, what is going on here? Why is irrationality winning? Well, it's always going to be there. How do we contain it? Then you have art, you have music, you have spirituality, you have consciousness, you have all these really deep things. So you just start tugging at, why did this male who insisted that he's trans when he's not, and that acted like a tyrant for a week, this young man, incredibly charismatic, he's named Jamil, incredibly charismatic, incredibly foolish, but so powerful. Why did he act that way? You tug apart that and you get down into the roots of what it is to be a human being if you ask the right freaking questions, right? And so there's infinite content. So ultimately it's all about just casting yourself into the sea of chaotic content and then wrestling with the Leviathan down in there by flicking at minnows at first.
Yeah. Shaking the tree and seeing what falls. So,
oh yeah,
man, there's so many different ways I could go with this. Part of me wants to go talk about religion. The other part of me sees my notes and 30 minutes left and is like, talk about depression. And I guess maybe I'll tie.
Wait. There's a difference between depression and religion. Do you really think that?
I do.
What is the relationship between your depression and your spirituality?
Well,
zero? None?
No, I don't think it's zero. If I had to put a number on it, man, I don't even know. The first number that pops into my mind is 50%, but I don't really have, I've never thought about that question. So I don't.
Just spitballing, that's a pretty significant relationship between a feeling of despondency, of
it was a feeling of inadequacy. It was a feeling of being uncomfortable in my own body. I went through, it was about 10 years of pretty severe depression. I tried to take my life twice during that period. Really? And, you know, it was all a result of what should have been strong familial bonds deteriorating as a result of the death of a family member, the murder. An uncle was murdered. And the relationship between my mother and I deteriorated to the point where, getting calls from her would strike me with anxiety. Like, what am I about to be chastised for? How has she found fault in me? Which then created a belief in me that I was truly worthless or, inadequate. And, now that I'm speaking about it, it is interesting dynamic to think about spirituality and depression, because what eventually brought me out of it was community, specifically this music festival community out here in San Diego, Desert Hearts. I had been doing some therapy. I had what I guess you could say a spiritual experience on mushrooms that kind of cracked my mind open and helped me look at things from this like objective bird's eye view to understand the pain that my mom was going through and where that her treatment of me was coming from. It wasn't about me. It was about something much larger than me. So I don't know. What do you think the relationship between depression and spirituality is? Because you went through a little thing yourself, and I know that religion is part of your family story from the Greg interview, and I've heard you talk about doing Ramadan, I believe, right?
Yeah, I do Ramadan. It's good for me.
How do you view that?
I think that's interesting because you bring up community being the facilitator of that depression. And my own depression is a sense of detachedness. Well, there's different layers of it. There's like that detachedness of the person who thinks too much or is always examining things and kind of living on the outside. And then when those emotions come, then there's nothing really to sink myself into something. And community is a way in which we can not feel isolated and not feel that it relieves the burden of self-salvation, I guess, or of self just, trying to fix yourself in some way or fix
Being
yourself
part of a
according to what.
community does?
Yeah, being part of a community. And so that community doesn't have to be religious in nature. I think that there will be religious patterns that, if they are not explicit, will be implicit, and they can be stronger or weaker, but they're going to be there. Oh, that's an interesting thing. So a strong or weak kind of religious thing. So social justice is very strong religious, but it's implicit religious too, because it's hidden. Well, no, it's actually really explicit, but it's hidden as not being a religion, even though it's incredibly religious, but it's very strong religious. And then there's like kind of weaker religious communities. I think when you bring up music too, I think about this. I go through periods where I can't listen to music, especially when I'm composing my fiction. I can't listen to music because everything, the only way I can make sense is if I can sense it. So I really have to be connected to the sound. But then I go through phases where I get disconnected with that. And then I just pick up an album and then I just obsess over an artist's oeuvre, I'm going through Pink Floyd right now. And
Nice.
I can't get over how perfect of a work of art Dark Side of the Moon is. It's a perfect piece of art. And I listen to that. I have a decent stereo setup. It's got it's a surround sound setup, and I'll just sit in the middle of the room and listen to the whole album. I got this like Blu-ray version of it coming, that was specially mixed
Very
for
crisp.
5.1 sound. So we'll see how I go through that. But I just immerse myself in that. And then I go through their back catalog, and then I go through their fourth catalog before and after those places, and you kind of figure out where they go. And then you get into the stories of all the guys and like all the personalities and stuff like that. But there's just something about music. I was thinking about this because I was going through and rewriting a part of my book, chapter 11 we're on. And my character, Thomas, who's kind of based on me, and his writing's based on my writing. But I just went back in time 20 years, and I gave him all my experience. And then I recreated all of his naivety and his lust for life in me. And we kind of have this relationship over time. Presenting second thoughts to my first thoughts, and presenting my first thoughts back to my second thoughts. It's kind of live in me. And he's going through, in this chapter, he's going through this manic phase. He's been all pent up for a long time and taking things so seriously. And now he's just starting to just pop out of his shell. And I was just thinking about getting to a place where you can hear the music and really experience that music. Like we were talking about erotic curiosity, like having those two things going on, and then doing that with other people. This is the next step. I was going to say I've never done that step, but everything that I do with the interview is getting to that place where I can finally work with other people in this mode. But my creativity has been very selfish, very alone, because the writerly thing, it's like you are the author. You have that authorial expectation, and that can lead to a lot of depression. It lead to hardness. It can lead to a stiff neck because you're just separated from your environment. But when you're connected to music, I think that there is both a lightening aspect and then a spiritual aspect that comes in. So that religious thing that will kind of form in any group is lightened by music, because you can hear whether it's good or not. You can't really lie with music. It's all lying anyways, it's all manipulation, but you can kind of feel like, I guess you can be in communities that are into like really cheesy crap or really schlocky stuff and can feel that, but you can attenuate yourself aesthetically to people. And then that harmony is a sort of parasocial, or it's a super social. It lifts you out of yourself, and then you're communicating with people.
Yeah.
And then you're no longer thinking about your problems. You're working out emotions at that point. And I think a lot of depression, especially in our culture, comes from being too top heavy and not being able to let go of that and surrender ourselves and kind of really expand to be greater than what we are by going through all the things that are greater than us in us, right?
Right. It's like a very selfish or self-serving sort of perspective that has trapped us into, thinking and considering only our personal wants and needs, and taking us out of the grander view of, oh no, I'm just this small part in this larger thing. Your needs are important, but there's greater needs. And I think, the thing for me that was really special, or is special, about Desert Arts is, it's a small festival. There's only one stage of music, so everyone's listening to the same thing. Everyone's moving to the same rhythms, the same beats. And, I used to shoot video for the festival and edit it. And I would get one time I remember I got really stressed out, and I was talking to one of the sound guys, and he was like, just go stand in front of the speaker. Just go stand there for 10 minutes. I guarantee you'll feel better. And you do. You lose yourself. You lose all of those concerns of like, I didn't do this. You just become overwhelmed by the vibrations of the speaker, but also people around you, moving in time together, speaking without words. Like there's this sort of communication and understanding that takes place whenever everyone is on the same rhythm, right?
Yeah.
So what is your relationship with religion now then? And do you still go in and out of your depression? Is it still something you deal with, or is that a past chapter?
Well, it's cyclical. There's dirt in the world, and I get dirty, and then I have to get cleaned again. There's anxiety more than depression. I get anxious. My work, I have to balance that, because for some reason I got into a position where I can create content, and I have to, and because it's a living now somehow, and this weird trick of lights and sounds, I'm supported by what I do, so I have to keep on doing it, and I have to figure out a way to do that where people like what I do, and I like the me that what I do creates out of me, right? So it's a bunch of negotiations. Religion itself, it's a mixture of laziness and social anxiety that keeps me from going to church. I would really, really like to go to a Latin mass. But I think the Pope outlawed it or something. The Pope said it's not good because there was some dust up on Twitter. I don't know exactly the parameters of it, but people were really upset because of the Latin Mass. I was out in Europe a few years ago, and I saw this door. It was an old wooden door. I'm like, oh, what's behind the door? And I walk in, and it's this dusty place, and there was all this sounds, and I go in there, and there's a pew, and I sit down, and then I stand up, and I sit down, and I stand up, and I say the words, and I sit down, and I stand up. And I'm doing this. I've never been in, it's not ordained. What is it called? I didn't have what is that conversion where you're...
I don't know.
Anyway, there's a special word. But over the course of doing that, and the oldness of the building and the smoothness of the stones, I've started to see this blue light like vibrating on all of the surfaces, like this accumulated worship of centuries of people doing this. And then the Latin too bounded up inside of that. I'm like, oh, I can actually do this, because I have a deep spirituality. I have a very reordering persistent, habitual spiritual practice I do, but it's not a religion. It doesn't have words to it. It's just a receiving. It's just spontaneous, and I can't talk about it. It's because it's just going through me and stuff like that. But that religious part that ties me into a community would be really good. So I'm like, okay, well, let's try to find a Latin mass. And I go back to Portland after I'm in Europe, and I go find a Catholic church, and I go and sit down, and the guy's speaking English. And I got so mad, and I started cussing in my head the entire time. Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do this. I don't want to argue. I don't want to argue. I don't want any language involved in this. I want words, but no language. Thank you. You know, so I just couldn't do it. And then I didn't have the chutzpah or whatever to find a Latin mass.
Well, what's up with Ramadan? How is that good for you? How did you get involved with that?
Well, in 1998, I stumbled upon a spiritual group that was that showed me something that I'd been seeking. I've been seeking closeness with this Holy Spirit. In Christianity, we call it the Holy Spirit. And people talk about the Holy Spirit in the Christian churches that I've been to, but you're like, well, where's the Holy Spirit? And every once in a while, I'd find, oh, like, okay, there's that Holy Spirit. And I found this spiritual group that it was just Holy Spirit, nothing else. I mean, there's people, so there's other crap, you know, because people bring crap with them, but the actual practice is just the Holy Spirit. And that was in 1998. It's called Subud. And I was brought to an honest relationship with myself and the world through that practice, that spontaneous communion with the Spirit. And then over time, the Subud was founded by a Muslim guy, but he said, you know, I'm Muslim, but this is for all religions. It's not for any religion. It's for all religions. But within religion, you have to listen. The religion, all these religions, all this advice is very good. It's there for us. It's from God to us. So practice whichever one you are. And one of the things in most religions, at least in the Western religions or the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, there's a month of fasting. For Christians, there's Lent. For Muslims, there's Ramadan. And then Judaism has a couple of like weekends or something like that, a few days or a week of fasting. Or some sort of purgation where you just withhold food from yourself for a certain specific period, and you start to really listen to your hunger. And if you start to listen to your hunger, you start to listen to all your hungers, all the different things that are motivating your greed, your lust, your desire to be right, your desire to fight, you know, your desire to dominate, you know, all that stuff is a necessary part of being a human being in this world. But there's a consciousness that ends up serving all those things rather than articulating them in a harmony that serves the consciousness. If you are in a right state of being, all that makes you up is serving your right state of being rather than your mind or your consciousness serving your mind, serving your heart, serving your feelings, serving your hungers, right? And then you're just kind of you're an automaton. You're just acting out some sort of algorithm. Unless the only way to escape all that is to really listen. And in order to listen, you have to like actually step back and give things up to do that. And Ramadan was there. Ramadan it's a nice, it's not that hard. It's just sun up to sundown or 6 to 6 is how I do it, fasting. So it's not impossible. I mean, it's not really impossible, but it's difficult enough. And then, you know, the first 10 days are like all the toxins are getting out of you physically, and then the second 10 days you're kind of getting your bearings, and then those last 10 days, for whatever reason, those last 10 days of Ramadan, every year that I do it, I get a gift. I get some perspective on my life. This year was about my work. This year I woke up at 2:00 and I was just vibrating all over. My brain couldn't stop, and I just stopped it all. And I kind of understood what my work is in the world. And I understood the correct relationship between belief and will, or faith and will, or my worship of God and my work in the world. And that I was, for so long in my life, I'd been putting all of my eggs in my work. Like I will ultimately be judged by my work. The work that I do is how I'm judged ultimately. And it was inverted that night. I'm like, no, 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 no. My work is what is showing the evidence of what I am. I'm not judged by it. It's proving where I am in the world. It's proving who I am. Like that's how the spiritual, the numescent becomes real, is through work. And then the fruits of that, of your reality, of your character. So so it was just this little tiny twitch that like released so much anxiety about my relationship to what I produce.
Right. So it's like you have meaning and you are there, and your work becomes sort of like a little window that other people can see through to see who you are. It's not your work isn't
And me too.
You.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It shows me in the world. And also it proves any sort of gift that we are given, I believe. You called it talent. Anybody who has a talent, that talent is, it's whether you can manifest it or not, that talent, whatever it is, if you can find out what your talent is, that is probably the best way for you to make your way in the world. And ultimately, in order to live in the world, you have to give your gifts to other people. Like there's just a basic, they call it capitalism, but it's just nature. It's just, in order for me to be a part of society, I have to bring something to society. If you can figure out what you're good at, what you're naturally talented at, if you can figure that out, and then you can figure out how you can make it serve other people, then it creates this feedback loop where you become you, and you're lifting up the world and the world's lifting up you at the same time. And the proof of your character, the proof of your worth in the world eternally, as well as manifestly inside of time, is through the intersection of your will, your work, and other people. And then your soul and their soul and all that other stuff that's there, but you can't really talk about because it doesn't make any sense because it's not real in a way that we can speak about. It's beyond language, it's beyond work, but all that consciousness or whatever, all that spiritual stuff becomes real and tactile when you can create the pasta, pasta like beyond all pastas. You're like, oh no, that was the pasta, man. Like you gave me the pasta of God or whatever, because you like everything came together to make that thing.
You're Pastafarian now. Heard of that religion?
Pastafarian, is that a thing?
It's a real religion. Yeah, it's a real fake religion, I believe.
Yeah.
But it has a Wikipedia page. So
I don't even have a Wikipedia page. I'm not really a Pastafarian's more real than Benjamin Boyce at this point.
Obviously, you talk about some deep societal issues. And one of the things I noticed when watching the Evergreen documentary is there's a little bit of mockery that sometimes comes out, but you do maintain a very empathetic sort of perspective. I think in one of the videos you say something like, don't judge or mock these as individuals. Look at it as, the group. Look at it as a sociological type of lens. So I wonder, do you view yourself that way? And how do you, what role does empathy have to play in this whole thing? And how do you view your ability to tap into that?
Well, okay. See, the thing is that to be funny, you have to break some eggs.
But that's the thing. Comedy, I firmly believe that if we're going to get out of this mess, it's going to be because of either comedy or podcasts. One of the two is going to change things. But
why not both?
Yeah, both. Sure. I'm down.
There's a way to be, this is why it's a good tactic to play the identity politic. If you're going to talk about an identity issue, you enlist people of that identity, who break through that identity within 5 minutes. They're an individual who just happens to have the trapping of the identity. So one, it undermines the whole identity politic, but also it starts to give you understanding of that person and the empathy that we have, or that there's it's like there's eros and curiosity, but there's also a care. So you have that erotic curiosity, that's the spark and the motivator. And then you have like a very light caring. And that also comes from, my conception of this comes from the playground, from being a preschool teacher, where my job is just to walk around and make sure that kids don't hit each other over the head with shovels. Right. And then every once in a while engage them in soccer, whatever. And then kind of detach myself and think of a song and then get back into their thing and play Sands. But as the adult of 12 kids, as the scout leader of 12 kids, like there's the erotic curiosity of the playground, which is the field of learning, the field of engagement. But also there's that navigating of the complexities of the human being, of the needs of the human being. Like the human being needs attention like animals need food. Attention is the food of consciousness. So you have to give kids attention. That's why when they're climbing, they're like, look at me, look at me, look at me. And you give them attention, like, okay, I'll look at you. And then the dad thing to do, the dude thing to do, is say, you do a little better.
Yeah.
I see you, but so what? Like return them to that erotic curiosity. What is possible? What is possible? But, as a male in that ground, I still have care, but I tend towards that disappointment, not disappointment, but challenge. I'm there to challenge the kids, and that's my unique gift and what I'm better suited at. The females in that industry, and it's mostly females, like 97% females, are much more tuned to care. So I'm the catapult. I'll launch the kid, but they're the cushion. They'll catch the kid. Right. And there is a way, so empathy correctly conceived, and a lot of what we call wokeness is actually empathy hijacked. It's hijacked empathy, and then it's twisted upon itself it's a dopamine kind of weird morphine-like empathy, which is the wrong way to go. But if you have just the right amount of empathy, of caring, but not too much to interrupt the subject, but enough to, like when they reveal something very tender, like give them the attention that thing requires. When you get into a conversation where somebody's like, I'm broken, and you get there and you're like, and you say, I see that. I can't fix you, but I see that. I understand that I'm broken too. That exposure and participating in that exposure. And if you can give the right attention to that, if you can figure out, this is the angelic quality. If you can figure out the right attention to give people at any given moment, you're facilitating growth or healing or expansion of anything. So there's positions where you can be in where you're talking about the brokenness of something, of society or a human being. And you can just flip just a little bit, and without denigrating or dismantling or disparaging any of that, you can start to laugh, and you can step into this other way of viewing things. Like, this is really ridiculous. Everything is really, really ridiculous. And the ability to go from one to the other it's like being Houdini for any sort of occultism or any sort of cult. If you can go from caring to laughter and switch back and forth, you can slip out of any knot that any of these strong religions kind of try to put you into. And you become a slippery fish. And then when people get mad at you, if you can pay the right attention, or they come to cancel you, if you can pay them the right attention, they can't grab you. You're not even there. They can't even hate you. Even their anger can't land on you if you can be in the right state. And I think that state ultimately is the proof of being a spiritual person, the proof of being really mature, of being conscious, of being enlightened, let's say, is to really shed light on any situation and to really be a reflector, not the source yourself, but the reflector of light into any given situation. So ultimately, I think that is like the proof of any sort of spiritual itty,
Yeah. Well, it seems I picked that up as something that you try to embody. And I don't know. I feel as though if there could have been any number of other people who were there covering that event who would have done it much differently. And I'm sure it has been done much differently. But
there's a couple more documentaries going out, but all the students that swore they were going to make a documentary They can't. The story cannot. There have been some articles to try to tell the story in the pro-protester direction, but it doesn't actually stand up. You can't actually take the footage and you could probably tell a different story, more empathetic, and actually interview more of the protesters and get deeper. But the story is the story is the story. And I don't see any pro-protester stories coming out because it doesn't hold glue, because there's
Right.
something fundamentally broken about the ideology.
Well, the
only
footage
thing you can do-
contradicts the whole thing. Everything they're saying later in these meetings of, oh, we didn't do this. It's like, well, there's footage of you actually doing that exact thing. So either you're delusional or someone
Well, or
tampered this
even in the
footage.
moment, like screaming for justice while being incredibly unjust, screaming for safety while making everybody else safe. Like the whole thing is corrupt. It was so easily hackable by bad actors that you can't tell good actors from bad actors at all.
Yeah.
It's weird. I don't know, but I'm partial. I'm biased, and I'm anti-woke. So that's my spin on all this.
What do you got coming up next, Benjamin Boyce?
What's up next?
Yeah.
Chapter 11. I have a very clear calendar for the rest of the month. I've been doing it, posting interviews every other day, and I have a backlog, that I'm going to eke out over the summer. And then I'm going through a process of figuring out who am I now? What do I want to do next? What do I want to become next? So I'm kind of just waiting for the impetus to do that, and then noodling around in my fictions while I wait, listen to some Pink Floyd and do chill interviews,
Yeah. How do you want to be remembered, as the author or the journalist interviewer?
I want, this is what I want. If I can want something like this, like I want somebody to, I just like, okay, this is the thought experiment. This would give me a lot of pleasure. Maybe they'll even be listening to this. 100 years from now, I want somebody, well, the academy finally gets rebuilt and it's an actual academy, and somebody wants
So
to
we're
figure
talking
out.
fantasy. Okay.
Yeah, this is the fantasy. So yeah, so the academy is completely destroyed and it's being remade. And somebody's like, well, how did the academy die? How did it die? And so they go into our period of time and they're like, okay, well, there was a lot of stuff going on here that led to that. And there's all these ideas, but then there's this evergreen thing. Like, it seems like everything kind of came to a head right here. And this showed everything that was going to happen, and it incorporates everything. So it's a good test study. And they're like, oh, Benjamin Boyce, he collected all this stuff, and I'll have an archive, And then they're going around and it's like, wait, why is he referencing this thing? Or why is there this weird footnote? Or what's this about this Substack? And then you just kind of find that this guy who is a footnote in history has this entire thing that he's inserted into history that's completely unrelated to history. It's a complete fantasy tale that's just trying to like remodel the English language and narrative itself into a completely novel form. So completely just completely hide that little cavern, in history. That's ultimately would bring me so much delight.
Huh. I find it very interesting that, judging from the Greg interview, it sounded like you had a large ambition to be a literary giant, or at least intellectual or something of that nature. And it seems
I'm a white male. I'm a white male. Our time is gone. Our time is done. There's nowhere for us to do but podcasts. That's the only territory that we can exist within, because literature belongs to the woke now. So
for now. But what I was saying is, I find it interesting that now, when you think about your legacy, it is tied to this thing that you happened upon. It's not, you didn't create that event. You did do what is right now the best job covering it and organizing the event itself and what led up to the event and the aftermath of the event. But I just find it interesting that that has become now what you hope to be remembered by.
see, that's the thing. Like, there's no hope. I don't. That's just how people are.
Putting
I'm
words
just
into your
imagining.
mouth.
This is well. No, I want to just challenge that, because I don't hope that I'm only remembered for Evergreen. I guess I'm going to be. Like Brett Weinstein, he's moved on to COVID and ivermectin, Like
Yeah.
I moved
He's
on to
round
gender,
three. He's on round 3 of his butt against power right now. It's like
Yeah, no,
Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, he's gonna do a whole bunch of sequels too. We'll see how he does. But there's life after Evergreen. But I'm just saying that Evergreen's probably the most historical thing. I just just being in all honesty, my fiction is for 2,000 people at most, but Evergreen's for 200,000 people. And what happened in 2020 was Evergreen. That was just Evergreen on the large scale. I mean, Evergreen is just this impossibly relevant event, and I just happened to be there with a certain set of skills to do it. So you don't choose that. Again, you don't choose the greatness or that peak thing, but you put yourself in a position for that, and then come what may.
Love it. Well, thank you, Benjamin. I appreciate you taking the time to chat. And
Thank you,
I
Eric.
will
This is fun.
Certainly be keeping up on what you do. Yeah.